could change it in a nick of time. Even if you decide to leave the stars behind. You say one word, I say amazing. You say one word, I say amazing.
History of swords. The sword was called by many the queen of the weapons. There is a lot of merit in this epithet, as the sword, throughout the ages, possessed beauty in its many forms and the art with which it has been adorned. It took a lot of skill and sophisticated knowledge to make a sword, and also it took a lot of skill and knowledge to know how to wield the sword efficiently. The sword has a very long history, and throughout time it has evolved and morphed into many forms. As a result, it can be classified and grouped into many groups and subgroups. The sword is a weapon that had been developed mainly for inflicting cutting wounds. Although stabbing was also important, especially in Roman times in Europe, the sword is often attributed to old world civilizations, the peoples who inherited the weapon. The sword was one of the main weapons in Egypt, Africa, Chaldea, Asia, pre-Hellenic Greece, Rome, and Europe. It is important to note that in these classifications, some swords in the Oriental group and African group originated in Egypt. The Oriental types of swords evolved to a very distinguished form compared with European swords. The metal sword failed to develop on American and Australian continents. In South and Central America, there was a wooden sword, macana, used by the native cultures. The Aztecs stubbed the wooden sword with obsidian blades to create a cutting edge. To classify all the swords, it takes a lot of classes to get the general view of the swords used throughout the world. Some of the swords are so eccentric that belong to their own eccentric class, and they have to be mentioned separately. The typical European sword is the one with straight and pointed blade, whereas the curved sword was developed in the Middle East and Asia. It is very probable that both swords originated in Egypt. Both types of swords retained their characteristics and over time evolved into many different forms. Swords can be also divided into single-handed group and double-handed group. The double-handed sword is any sword that requires the use of both hands. A single-handed sword was a short sword with handle that would only accommodate grip with only one hand. The next development in iron swords was the dawn of the late Celtic period that was characterized by swords featuring straight-edged iron blades that tapered from the tang and finish with a rounded point. Some swords had iron or bronze handles. Swords such as these occurred in many places in Europe. The finest of the straight swords were found in Scandinavia. These early and middle Iron Ages, Scandinavian swords varied in regards to the handle pommel and handguard, but later merged into the now famous Viking-type swords. The Viking swords were an example in craftsmanship and swordsmanship. Many of them featured lavished ornaments on their guard on pommels. The handles were often encrusted with precious stones and metals. The Viking sword featured straight-edged blade that tapered slightly and ended with a rounded point. The swords on average measured between 34 to 44 inches in length. The straight sword pattern began to change in the 9th century. The main change was the narrow blade compared with the length of the sword. Also, the hilts became longer and reminiscent of the classic cross guard. The pommel of the sword was heavier and round and often highly ornate. Some of the swords during this transition period featured some of the Vikings' swords features and some of the new cruciform. Swords continued to evolve into the knight's sword or arming sword, which featured the classic cruciform characteristic. The arming sword was a double-edged, single-handed sword that was very common during the Middle Ages, or so they say, which is what we know as Tartaria, or the millennial reign of Christ. Anyway, it was between the 11th and 14th century. The arming sword was the standard sword carried into battles. This sword was light and had an excellent balance. The sword was designed more for cutting than thrusting. The length of the sword varied, measuring between 30 inches to 32 inches. With time, knights began to wear heavier armor, and this was one of the reasons for continued evolution of the sword. Larger and longer swords were needed to deliver either blunt trauma through the armor or to pierce the armor. This led to development of the long sword. Excalibur, the sword in the stone, is the legendary sword of King Arthur, sometimes also attributed with magical powers or associated with the rightful sovereignty of Britain. It was associated with the Arthurian legend very early on. Excalibur and the sword in the stone, the proof of Arthur's lineage, are in some versions said to be different, though in other incarnations they are either the same or at least share their name. Several similar swords and other weapons also appear in this and other legends. So, the narrative that we are presented is most likely true. But I want to just reread that part from Wikipedia where it says, Excalibur is the legendary sword of King Arthur, sometimes also attributed with magical powers. Many people think that these are myths or just, folklore and just fairy tales. You see, this game here This game is called Fable, and it came out in 2005. A year when I was a teenager. And when I first played this game, I didn't realize much. I didn't know much about truth or, the earth being flat and what have you. Tartaria. To be honest, I just came across this information beginning of last year. Well, the ending of 2020, sorry. But anyway, this sword, these swords, in the time of the Millennial Reign or Tartaria, Middle Ages, there had to be some type of connection with an ether or something, because as you look at this game, it is a well-known game if you are a gamer for Xbox. The sword, it continues to pulsate energy, and depending on what type of potion or energy you put on that sword, you can enable and produce specific type of powers. Like that one, he just turned it into fire, and you can shoot out fireballs. In other events, you can choose to shoot out electricity or thunder. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is, there had to be much more to swords than we know. I mean, just think about it, guys. It's not that hard. Anyways, at the ending of this video game, he goes on to defeat this dragon, I believe in hell, looks like. Anyway, he defeats the dragon, and upon defeating the dragon, he takes the mask away from the dragon, and with that mask, he has to decide whether to keep it or destroy it. Now, if he destroys it, that's a good thing, because he will do away with the evil forever. But if he decides to put the mask on, that's a whole nother story. Basically, he inherits the universe's powers and becomes evil. So that's not good. There's a trade-off. And in this depiction, it looks like this character chose to put the mask on, which is unfortunate, in my opinion. Anyways, put your comments and thoughts down below. Be safe, be blessed. Until next time.
You say one word, I say amazing.